It has now been almost 10 years since Pokemon X and Y introduced a whole new Pokemon era on the Nintendo 3DS. Pokemon X and Y were the first generation on the system, and represented Generation 6 of the game series. And this generation brought some of the biggest innovations to the franchise. It was a change from 2D to 3D, a new Pokemon type was added for the first time in 14 years, the Fairy type, and Mega Evolutions brought new life to the battle system. There was also customization, Pokemon Amy, new battle types, as well as a few other things. So calling it a big jump is in no way an exaggeration, but the 6th generation was also unique in another way. It was the first generation without one or more extra versions. From the 1st to the 4th generation, there was always a slightly expanded version of the original 2 games. In the 5th generation, we even got 2 sequels, which offered a lot more new content. Pokemon X and Y, on the other hand, were completely different, and a Pokemon Z, which fans had long suspected, was never released. There were some perfectly plausible reasons that a Pokemon Z would come. First of all, as just mentioned, extra versions were commonplace up until that point. It's easy money for the developers, since they are only slightly improved versions of the original games and still sell well. But the naming of the Pokemon also certainly hinted at this. Xerneas and Yveltal represent the X and Y of the games in their names. Pokemon X, Xerneas, Pokemon Y, Yveltal. Zygarde, the third Pokemon of the trio, starts with a Z, which is why a Pokemon Z was quite plausible. In addition, because of the story of Pokemon X and Y, some also assumed that a Pokemon Z would be released. The story of Team Flare and AZ in the games left a lot to be desired, and fans had hoped that it would be improved in Pokemon Z to fill in the gaps. We now live nearly 10 years in the future, and know that a Pokemon Z was never made. After Pokemon X and Y came the remakes of the 3rd generation, Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. This was then followed by Pokemon Sun and Moon, and then Pokemon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, which then ended the era on the Nintendo 3DS. So what became of Pokemon Z? Unfortunately, there is no clear answer to this, but at least some guesses. A common theory at the time was that they abandoned extra versions because they simply didn't sell as well as the original games. For example, Pokemon Gold and Silver sold about 24 million copies, but Pokemon Crystal only sold about 6 million copies. Pokemon Diamond and Pearl sold about 18 million copies, but Pokemon Platinum only 8 million copies. The interest in extra versions was always much smaller, which is why some fans assumed that they stopped making them completely. However, the existence of Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon would later disprove this. Because extra versions, with the exception of maybe Black and White 2, are only slightly modified versions of the original games, the effort is not particularly big. So I don't really think this reason is plausible, since it would have been easy money for relatively little work. Much more plausible, however, is the theory that there simply wasn't enough time and resources available. Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire were released just 1 year after Pokemon X and Y. All available resources were probably put into the 3rd generation, instead of continuing to work on the 6th. Since Pokemon X and Y seem quite unfinished, this also indicates this time pressure. The 3D effect was only partially implemented, there were performance issues, the games had the least amount of new Pokemon, some story elements seemed unfinished, and the post-game was also barely existent. Pokemon X and Y were most likely launched early to meet deadlines, so that Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire could be released in the following year. If you want to put any trust into leaks, according to leaks, extra versions were actually planned, but then got cancelled because they simply didn't have enough time. Those who still longed for a Pokemon Z, however, at least got a small consolation prize in Pokemon Sun and Moon. Zygarde was given a bit of a spotlight in Pokemon Sun and Moon, and got 2 new forms. A small sign that the developers had not completely forgotten about the Pokemon.